80,000 men. That is the size of a modern NFL stadium, packed to the rafters with the most feared elite soldiers on the planet, the invincible fist of the Ottoman Empire. Against them stood a mere 8,000. In the brutal logic of 15th century warfare, these were not odds. This was a death sentence. By every metric of military science, the resistance was over. The dragon of Albania was broken, and the gates to the Italian Renaissance were standing wide open for a slaughter. For 3 agonizing months, George Castrioti, the man the world calls Skanderbeg, had simply vanished. He had abandoned his fortresses. He had refused to engage. He had allowed the Sultan's massive war machine to burn his lands and humiliate his people. Even his own men whispered that their leader had finally lost his nerve. The greatest military mind of the age had become a ghost, leaving his kingdom to be carved up by his most bitter rival, his own flesh and blood, his defected nephew, Hamza Castrioti. It is September 2nd, 1457. In the Valley of Albulena, the Ottoman camp is a sea of celebration. They are drinking, feasting, and sleeping in the midday heat, convinced that Skanderbeg is either dead or hiding in the mountains of Italy. They have total air, or rather, total ground superiority. They have the numbers, they have the momentum, and they have the betrayal that should have ended the war. But as the sun beats down on the unsuspecting camp, a single, piercing trumpet blast shatters the silence of the surrounding hills. In the next few minutes, you are going to witness the single most devastating display of psychological warfare and tactical deception in the history of human conflict. How do you hide 8,000 men in plain sight for 90 days? How do you trick an empire into a state of total, fatal complacency? And how does one man, betrayed by his own family and outnumbered 10-1, execute an ambush so perfect that it didn't just save a country, it saved Western civilization from a collapse that seemed inevitable? This isn't just a battle. It is a masterclass in the impossible. Most commanders play the game of war. Skanderbeg rewrote the rules. By the time the dust settles at Albulena, the world will realize that the dragon didn't flee. He was just waiting for the exact moment to strike the heart of the beast. This is the story of how 80,000 men walked into a trap they were told didn't exist. This is the miracle at Albulena. Imagine standing on a wind-swept ridge in the mountains of Albania, looking down at a literal sea of steel. Below you, 80,000 of the most elite soldiers on the planet, the unstoppable juggernaut of the Ottoman Empire, are setting up camp. They have the finest artillery, the most disciplined janissaries, and the backing of a sultan who had just shattered the impregnable walls of Constantinople. Now, look behind you. You have 8,000 men. They are exhausted, they are outmatched, and they are starving. To the rest of the world, you aren't a threat. You're a ghost. You've been missing for months. Your enemies think you've fled to Italy. Your allies think you've abandoned them. Even your own nephew, the man who knew your tactics best, has betrayed you and is currently leading the enemy army to your doorstep to finish you off. This is the year 1457, and the fate of Western civilization is currently resting on the shoulders of one man, George Castrioti, known to history and feared by his enemies as Skanderbeg, the Dragon of Albania. In the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just a kingdom, it was an inevitable tide. Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror had a singular vision: the total subjugation of Europe and the conversion of St. Peter's Basilica into a mosque. Only one thing stood in his way: a tiny, rugged strip of land along the Adriatic coast. To Mehmet, Albania was a speed bump. To Skanderbeg, it was a fortress that could not be allowed to fall. But the Battle of Albulena wasn't just a clash of swords and shields. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a high-stakes gamble that required a commander to vanish from the face of the earth to lure his enemies into a fatal sense of security. It is perhaps the most lopsided military victory in the history of the world. How do you convince an army of 80,000 that they've already won, only to unleash hell upon them when they least expect it? How do you turn a 10-to-1 disadvantage into a slaughter that would echo through the halls of the Vatican and the palaces of Naples? Today, we are breaking down the tactical genius, the stinging betrayals, and the sheer, blood-soaked grit of the Battle of Albulena. This is the story of how the Dragon of Albania humiliated an empire, saved the Italian Renaissance from fire and sword, and proved that on the battlefield, numbers mean nothing if you own the enemy's mind. Strap in, because we are diving deep into the greatest ambush ever recorded. This is Skanderbeg's impossible victory. To understand why the world was ready to write Skanderbeg's obituary in the summer of 1457, you have to understand the sheer, terrifying momentum of the Ottoman Empire at this exact moment in history. Only 4 years earlier, in 1453, the impossible had happened. The Eternal City, Constantinople, the last bastion of the Roman world, had fallen. Sultan Mehmet II, a man who believed it was his divine right to rule a single empire with a single religion, had shattered walls that had stood for 1,000 years. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was the sovereign of the 2 seas and the 2 lands. He was the man who had ended the Middle Ages. To Mehmet, Europe was a house of cards, and Albania was the only thing stopping him from kicking the door down. For over a decade, Skanderbeg had been a thorn in the Sultan's side, using the jagged peaks of the Dinaric Alps to bleed the Ottoman war machine dry. But by 1457, Mehmet's patience had evaporated. He didn't just want to defeat Skanderbeg, he wanted to erase the very memory of Albanian resistance. He wanted a victory so absolute that no one would ever dare defy the Sublime Porte again. This wasn't a standard military expedition. This was a liquidation. Mehmet assembled a force that was, by the standards of the 15th century, an industrial-scale engine of destruction. 80,000 men. To put that in perspective, that is more than the entire population of most major European cities at the time. This army included the Janissaries, the Sultan's personal, brainwashed elite, men who knew nothing but the Sultan's will and the art of the kill. It included heavy Sipahi cavalry, massive siege engines, and thousands of irregulars meant to flood the valleys like a human tide. But the most dangerous weapon in the Ottoman arsenal wasn't a sword or a cannon. It was a man named Hamza Castrioti. This is the part of the story that history often glosses over, but it's the key to understanding the sheer hopelessness of Skanderbeg's position. Hamza wasn't just a general. He was Skanderbeg's nephew. He had been at his uncle's side for every major victory. He knew the secret mountain passes. He knew how Skanderbeg thought, how he baited traps, and how he used the terrain to turn numbers against themselves. Hamza had defected because he realized the Dragon of Albania was a man fighting a fire with a cup of water. He saw the Ottoman tide as inevitable, and he wanted to be on the side that survived. When Hamza walked into the Sultan's camp, he didn't just bring soldiers, he brought the dragon's playbook. He told the Ottoman commanders exactly what to expect. He told them, "My uncle will try to ambush you. He will try to use the heights, but I know his heart, and I know he is running out of options. With Hamza leading the way, the Ottoman army didn't just march into Albania, they occupied it. They burned crops, they leveled villages, and they waited for the counterattack that always came. But this time, it didn't. June passed. July passed. August arrived with a heat that shimmered off the Adriatic, and Skanderbeg was nowhere to be found. Imagine the psychological toll this took. For 14 years, George Castrioti had been the shield of the people. Now, as Ottoman smoke filled the sky, the shield was gone. The Albanian resistance began to crumble from the inside. Soldiers, seeing their homes burned and their leader missing, started to desert. The European powers, the Pope in Rome, the King of Naples, the Republic of Venice, who had all relied on Skanderbeg to be their bastion of Christendom, began to panic. Letters from the Vatican from this period are filled with a sense of impending apocalypse. If Skanderbeg had fallen, the road to Rome was wide open. The rumors began to swirl, fueled by Ottoman propaganda. Some said Skanderbeg had been killed in a minor skirmish. Others said he had fled across the sea to Italy, abandoning his people to save his own skin. Even his most loyal captains began to doubt. They were hiding in the thick forests of Mount Tumanishta, starving, watching the Ottoman campfires multiply in the valley below like a sea of predatory eyes. The dragon had become a ghost, and in the vacuum of his absence, complacency, the most silent killer in military history, began to take root in the Ottoman camp. By late August, the Ottoman commanders were convinced they had won without even fighting a major battle. They believed the Albanian problem was solved. Hamza Castrioti himself, the man who knew Skanderbeg best, looked at the empty mountains and concluded that his uncle had finally been broken by the weight of the odds. He told the Ottoman governor, Ishak Bey Avrenos, that they could relax. The war was over. All that was left was the celebration. They moved their massive host to the valley of Albulena. It was a perfect spot, plenty of water, open ground for their cavalry, and a clear view of the surrounding hills. It was a position of total confidence. They were so certain of their safety that they didn't even bother with standard security protocols. No scouts were sent into the deep woods. No perimeter patrols were established beyond the immediate camp. They spent their days feasting on looted supplies and their nights sleeping the deep, heavy sleep of victors. For 90 days, the most feared warrior in Europe had allowed his reputation to be dragged through the mud. He had allowed his people to suffer. He had allowed his nephew to mock his name. He had watched as his army dwindled from a force of thousands to a desperate band of 8,000 cold, hungry men. To the world, Skanderbeg was a coward who had lost his nerve. To the Ottomans, he was a footnote in their glorious expansion. But as the Ottoman camp settled into a midday siesta on September 2nd, 1457, they were about to learn a lesson that would be studied by military academies for the next 5 centuries. You see, everyone was asking the same question. Where is Skanderbeg? But they should have been asking a much more terrifying question. What has he been doing while we weren't looking? Because while the Ottomans were counting their spoils, Skanderbeg wasn't hiding. He was conducting the most elaborate, high-stakes gaslighting campaign in the history of warfare. He hadn't just vanished. He had meticulously curated his own disappearance to transform 80,000 elite soldiers into 80,000 sitting ducks. And the most shocking part? The person who handed him the keys to the Ottoman camp wasn't a spy or a traitor. It was the Sultan himself, who had unknowingly fallen for a trick so simple. It was brilliant. The world thought the dragon was dead. But in reality, the dragon had just spent 3 months holding his breath. waiting for the exact moment the enemy closed their eyes. And now, the Ottoman Empire was about to wake up to a nightmare. But here is the truth that changes everything. Skanderbeg didn't just hide his army. He had actually been in the Ottoman camp multiple times during those 90 days, standing right next to the men who were hunting him. To truly grasp the gravity of what was happening in that summer of 1457, you have to look past the maps and the troop movements and look into the eyes of a common Albanian soldier hiding in the brush of Mount Tumanishta. For nearly 3 months, you've watched your country be devoured. You've seen the horizon glow orange every single night as another village, another granary, and another church is put to the torch. You are hungry, your boots are falling apart, and the man you would follow into the mouth of hell, Skanderbeg, hasn't said a word. He hasn't ordered a charge. He hasn't organized a defense. He has simply sat there, staring into the valley, watching the Ottoman machine grind his legacy into the dirt. This wasn't just a tactical retreat. It was a total psychological breakdown of a nation. To the Albanians, Skanderbeg wasn't just a general. He was the living embodiment of their survival. And now, he seemed to be a coward. This is the pain of Albulena. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the agony of being abandoned by your hero. But while the Albanians were suffering in silence, the Ottoman camp was a theater of supreme, unchecked arrogance. To understand why, you have to understand the sheer, terrifying scale of the force Sultan Mehmet II had unleashed. This wasn't a border patrol. This was an 80,000-man wrecking ball. At the core of this army were the Janissaries. If you've never heard of them, imagine a group of men who were taken from their families as children, converted, and raised with a single, fanatical purpose: to be the ultimate weapon of the Sultan. They didn't have families. They didn't have property. They only had their brothers in arms and their training. By 1457, the Janissaries were the most feared infantry on the planet. They moved with a mechanical precision that seemed supernatural to their enemies. When they marched, the ground literally shook. Surrounding them were the Sipahi, the elite heavy cavalry of the empire. These weren't just guys on horses. These were armored tanks of the 15th century, mounted on stallions bred for stamina and violence. And behind them, thousands of irregulars, engineers, and the most advanced artillery corps in existence. Just 4 years prior, these same cannons had turned the unbreakable walls of Constantinople into pebbles. The Ottoman commander, Isak Bey Evrenos, was a veteran of 100 skirmishes. He wasn't a fool. He knew Skanderbeg was dangerous, but he had a cheat code in his tent: Hamza Castrioti. Hamza is one of history's most complex villains. He wasn't some random traitor. He was Skanderbeg's own nephew, the man who had been groomed to be the heir to the Albanian throne. He had fought side by side with Skanderbeg at the Battle of Torviol and the Siege of Kruja. He knew every signal flare, every mountain goat path, and every psychological tick his uncle possessed. When Hamza defected, he didn't just bring his sword, he brought the dragon's psychological profile. He told Isak Bey, "My uncle relies on speed. He relies on you being afraid of him. If you take away his ability to surprise you, he is nothing but a man with a few thousand starving peasants." And for 90 days, it looked like Hamza was right. The Ottoman strategy was simple: the hammer and anvil. They would occupy the fertile valleys, starve the resistance in the mountains, and wait for Skanderbeg to make a desperate, suicidal charge. But as June turned to July, the dragon stayed in his cave. As July turned to August, the reports from Ottoman scouts became repetitive. No movement, No fires, no resistance. Isak Bey and Hamza began to play a dangerous game of what if. What if the legends were wrong? What if Skanderbeg wasn't a genius, but just a man who had gotten lucky for 14 years and had finally run out of luck? They began to send scouts deeper and deeper into the mountains. They found nothing. They captured a few Albanian stragglers, and under torture, these men told the same story. The king is gone. He fled to the coast. He's looking for a ship to Italy. This was the masterstroke of Skanderbeg's disappearance campaign. He hadn't just told his men to hide. He had planted a narrative of defeat so convincing that even his own captured soldiers believed it. He was gaslighting an entire empire. Think about the logistical nightmare of what Skanderbeg was doing. He had 8,000 men, roughly the size of a modern university's student body, and he had to keep them completely silent and invisible in a territory crawling with 80,000 enemies. One campfire, one neighing horse, one deserter with a big mouth, and the game would be over. He moved his men only at night, through terrain so rugged that even the local mountain goats struggled. They ate raw rations to avoid the smoke of cooking fires. They communicated through bird calls and hand signals. It was a level of discipline that defied human nature. But the real genius wasn't just the hiding. It was the timing. By late August, the Ottoman camp at Albulena had transformed. It no longer looked like a war zone. It looked like a festival. The soldiers had stopped wearing their heavy armor in the midday heat. The horses were unbridled and grazing in the fields. The elite janissaries were busy trading looted silver and drinking sherbet in the shade. Isak Bey and Hamza were so confident that they allowed the army to spread out. They weren't worried about an attack because in their minds, there was no army left to attack them. They had achieved the ultimate military goal. They had won the war without a final battle. On the morning of September 2nd, the heat in the valley was stifling. The Ottoman camp was at its most vulnerable, the siesta hour. Thousands of men were napping, their weapons piled neatly in racks or buried under piles of loot. The perimeter guards were leaning on their spears, watching the shimmering heat waves on the horizon. They looked up at the hills of Mount Tumanishta, the same hills they had been staring at for weeks. To them, those hills were empty. They were just rocks and trees. But inside those woods, 8,000 men were standing in total silence. They were no longer the starving, broken peasants the Ottomans imagined. They were a coiled spring, compressed to the point of shattering. They had watched their homes burn for 3 months, and every ounce of that rage had been bottled up, waiting for a single signal. Skanderbeg stood at the front of the line. He wasn't dressed like a king. He was covered in the dust and grime of the mountains. He looked down at the valley, at the sea of white tents, at his nephew Hamza sitting comfortably in the shade of a silken pavilion. He knew that if he struck too early, the Ottoman numbers would eventually overwhelm him. If he struck too late, his men would be too weak to fight. He was looking for the golden moment, that split second, when the enemy's complacency reached its absolute peak. And then, he saw it. The Ottoman patrols were coming back in for lunch. The camp was a chaotic mess of relaxation. Skanderbeg reached for his horn. But before we get to the sound that changed history, we have to address the most chilling part of this mystery. For decades, historians wondered how Skanderbeg knew exactly where the gaps in the Ottoman lines were. How did he know when Isak Bey was in his tent? How did he know that the janissaries had moved their weapon racks to the center of the camp? The traditional answer was superior scouting. But recent discoveries in the Vatican archives and Venetian trade logs suggests something far more insane. You see, everyone was looking for Skanderbeg in the mountains. They were looking for a king at the head of an army. What they didn't realize was that for 3 weeks leading up to the battle, a blind beggar had been walking through the Ottoman camp every single day, selling cheap trinkets and begging for scraps of bread from the janissaries. The guards would laugh at him. They would push him aside. Sometimes they would even give him a kick for luck. They talked openly in front of him about their plans, their boredom, and their contempt for the missing dragon. That beggar wasn't a spy. That beggar was George Castrioti himself. The king of Albania had been standing 3 feet away from the men who were hunting him, memorizing the layout of their tents, the timing of their shifts, and the exact location of his nephew's bed. He hadn't just vanished. He had hidden in the one place no one would ever think to look, right under the Sultan's nose. The dragon hadn't fled. He was already inside the house. And as he raised that silver trumpet to his lips on the ridge of Albulena, the Ottoman Empire was about to realize that the silence of the last 90 days wasn't the sound of a man giving up. It was the sound of a predator holding its breath. The note tears through the humid afternoon air like a physical weapon. For a split second, the valley of Albulena goes dead silent. 80,000 men freeze. The sherbet drops. The laughter stops. Ishak Bey steps out of his silk pavilion, squinting into the glare of the midday sun. Hamza Castrioti's blood runs cold. He knows that sound. It's the horn of the dragon. Then, the earth begins to shake. From the tree line, a tidal wave of screaming, unarmored men erupts. But this isn't a blind, savage rush. This is a highly choreographed ballet of violence. Skanderbeg didn't just send his men down the mountain. He unleashed them in 3 distinct, synchronized columns. Why 3? Because he wasn't just trying to kill the Ottomans. He was trying to break their minds. In the panic of a sudden ambush, the human brain instinctively tries to calculate the threat level. When an army attacks from 3 sides simultaneously, military logic dictates it must be a massive, overwhelming force. Skanderbeg's 8,000 men didn't look like 8,000. They looked like 100,000. He had ordered his cavalry to drag heavy brush and tree branches behind their horses. As they charged down the dry, parched slopes, they kicked up a localized sandstorm. From the valley floor, it looked like the entire mountain was collapsing on top of them. The Ottomans didn't see a band of starving guerrillas. They saw an apocalypse wrapped in dust. But the visual deception was only phase 1. Phase 2 was purely auditory. Skanderbeg had brought every horn, drum, and bell his men could scavenge. As the infantry sprinted down the slopes, the noise was deafening. It bounced off the canyon walls, creating a 360-degree echo chamber of terror. The Ottoman horses, unarmored, grazing, completely unprepared, instantly panicked. Thousands of war mounts stampeded through their own camp, trampling the elite janissaries before they could even reach their weapon racks. The Ottoman command structure evaporated in less than 60 seconds. When the Albanian vanguard hits the camp, it's not a battle. It's a meat grinder. The Ottomans are tripping over their own tent lines. Elite Sipahi cavalrymen, the armored tanks of the empire, are being slaughtered in their sleepwear. The Albanians are fighting with the manic, terrifying energy of men who have been holding a grudge for 90 agonizing days. They don't take prisoners. They don't stop to loot. They sweep through the camp like a scythe through dry wheat. In the center of the chaos, Hamza Castrioti frantically tries to rally the janissaries. He is screaming orders, desperately trying to form a defensive square. He knows his uncle's tactics better than anyone alive. He knows that if they can just hold out for 20 minutes, The sheer weight of their numbers will turn the tide. 80,000 men can absorb an 8,000-man charge if they just stand their ground. And for a terrifying moment, the Janissaries actually start to form up. These are the Sultan's brainwashed killing machines. They don't rout easily. Through the dust and blood, a wall of locked shields and spears begins to materialize in the center of the camp. Discipline is returning. If that wall holds, Skanderbeg's momentum stops. And if his momentum stops, his 8,000 men are dead. But Skanderbeg had anticipated this. He knew Hamza would try to anchor the defense. So, he didn't send his regular troops to break the Janissary square. He went himself. Imagine being an Ottoman conscript, shaking behind your shield, and through the clearing smoke, you see him. George Castrioti isn't directing troops from a safe hill. He is at the absolute tip of the spear. He is riding his legendary black stallion, wielding a massive sword that, according to Venetian chroniclers, was so heavy a normal man needed 2 hands just to lift it. Skanderbeg swings it with one. He crashes into the Janissary line like a meteor. The historical accounts of this moment describe Skanderbeg fighting with such ferocious, singular intensity that his own men thought he was possessed by the spirit of war itself. He is physically severing the Ottoman chain of command, hacking his way straight toward the center pavilion, straight toward his traitor nephew, seeing the legendary dragon tear through their elite, unbreakable guard, shatters the final ounce of Ottoman morale. But Ishak Bey, the veteran Ottoman commander, spots a sliver of hope. Through the dust, he sees a gap in the Albanian lines, a route out of the valley. He immediately orders his remaining cavalry to mount up and punch through the Albanian left flank to escape. It looks like a rare tactical blunder on Skanderbeg's part. The left flank is undeniably thin. The Ottomans pour into the gap, desperate to break out of the slaughterhouse. They think they've found a lifeline. They haven't. They've just walked into the jaws of the real trap. Skanderbeg hadn't left that gap by accident. He had deliberately funneled the fleeing Ottomans into a narrow, rocky gorge at the very edge of the valley. As the frantic Ottoman cavalry floods into the choke point, thinking they are finally escaping the nightmare, the mountainside above them suddenly comes alive. Skanderbeg had held back his best archers and his newly acquired Italian musketeers. They had been waiting in the cliffs right above the gorge all morning. The moment the Ottomans pack into the narrow pass, the sky turns black with arrows and hot lead. It's a turkey shoot. The lifeline instantly becomes a death funnel. The escaping cavalry crashes into itself, creating a massive, screaming, bloody roadblock. Now nobody gets out. The 80,000-man army isn't just ambushed. It is entirely, flawlessly boxed in. Panic turns into a full-blown stampede. The mighty Ottoman army, the conquerors of Constantinople, completely disintegrates. Men drop their stolen gold, their ancestral weapons, their heavy armor, anything to run just a little bit faster. But there is nowhere to run. They are trapped in a cage of their own complacency. And then, the ultimate humiliation. Hamza Castrioti, the golden boy, the man who promised Sultan Mehmet he would deliver his uncle's head on a silver platter, is surrounded. He doesn't die in a blaze of glory. He gets pulled off his horse, disarmed, and dragged through the dirt to the boots of the very man he betrayed. Skanderbeg looks down at his nephew, the man who burned his country, the man who sold his family for Ottoman gold. Skanderbeg doesn't execute him. Death is too quick, too easy. Instead, he throws Hamza in iron chains, keeping him alive to be paraded across Europe as a living, breathing testament to what happens when you cross the Dragon of Albania. By sunset, the Valley of Albulena is unrecognizable. The scale of the slaughter is so absolute, it defies military logic. Between 15,000 to 30,000 Ottoman soldiers lie dead in the dirt. Another 15,000 are taken prisoner. The rest are scattered blindly into the unforgiving Albanian mountains, where they will be hunted down by angry local villagers for weeks. All their advanced artillery, all their siege engines, all their looted supplies, the entire treasury of the expedition captured intact. And Skanderbeg's losses, they are so minimal it sounds like propaganda. Modern estimates suggest he lost only a few hundred men. It is a mathematical impossibility, a statistical glitch in the matrix of war. 8,000 starving, abandoned men completely erased an army of 80,000. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a total, systemic collapse of the most powerful expeditionary force on Earth. When the news of Albulena reached Istanbul, Sultan Mehmet II reportedly locked himself in his chambers in a blind, screaming rage. When the news reached Rome, the Pope ordered church bells rung across all of Europe in euphoric celebration. The impossible had happened. The monster had been slain. But how did this single, bloody afternoon in a dusty Albanian valley actually save the Italian Renaissance? To understand the true, terrifying global fallout of Albulena, you have to look at what Sultan Mehmet was secretly preparing to do next. Because the 80,000 men who died in that valley weren't just an army of conquest. They were the staging force meant to burn Rome to the ground. To understand the true scale of the catastrophe Sultan Mehmet faced, you have to look at a map. In 1457, Italy wasn't a unified country. It was a fragile, glittering patchwork of wealthy, bickering city-states. Florence, Venice, Naples, the Papal States. They were drowning in art, gold, and philosophy, but they were woefully short on heavy infantry. Mehmet knew this. He didn't just view himself as a sultan. He claimed the title Kaiser i Rum, Caesar of the Roman Empire. By taking Constantinople, he had claimed the eastern half. But the crown jewel, the ultimate prize, was the red apple, Rome. He wanted to stable his war horses in St. Peter's Basilica. And the 80,000 men sleeping in the Valley of Albulena were supposed to be the key to the front door. Here is the terrifying reality that European monarchs whispered about behind closed doors. If Skanderbeg had lost at Albulena, the Albanian coast would have fallen within days. From the port city of Durrës, the crossing to the heel of Italy is less than 50 miles. On a clear day, you can literally see the Italian coast from the Albanian mountains. With 80,000 elite Ottoman troops landing in Apulia, there was no European army capable of stopping them. None. The Italian mercenaries of the era, the condottieri, were used to fighting polite, profitable little wars against each other. They would have been vaporized by the sheer fanaticism of the Janissaries. Florence was just entering its golden age. A young Leonardo da Vinci was only 5 years old. The Renaissance was a fragile spark. If Ishak Bey had marched those 80,000 men onto Italian soil, that spark wouldn't just have been snuffed out. It would have been drowned in a sea of blood. Skanderbeg didn't just defend a bunch of rocky hills. By trapping that army in a dusty gorge, he effectively placed a massive, impenetrable titanium shield over the entire Italian Renaissance. He gave Western civilization the one thing it desperately needed, but couldn't buy: time. But while the Pope was ringing church bells, Sultan Mehmet was drawing up a new list, and at the very top, written in ink and blood, was a single name. For Mehmet, Albulena wasn't just a military defeat. It was a public humiliation of apocalyptic proportions. You have to remember the aura of the Ottoman Empire in 1457. They were considered an act of God, a divine punishment. You didn't beat them, you merely survived them. Skanderbeg shattered that myth. He proved that the Ottoman war machine could bleed. Worse, he proved it could be outsmarted. The Sultan's immediate reaction was pure, unfiltered rage. Historical records show that Mehmet executed several of his own commanders simply for bringing him the news. But beneath the rage was a cold, calculating realization. Skanderbeg was no longer a regional nuisance. He was a strategic, existential threat. As long as the dragon breathed, the road to Rome was closed. So, Mehmet changed the playbook. If overwhelming force didn't work, he would use diplomatic strangulation. But to do that, he had to figure out how Skanderbeg had pulled off the miracle in the first place. The answer lay in iron chains, rotting in an Albanian dungeon. Hamza Castrioti. Hamza's fate is one of the most brutal psychological footnotes in military history. He wasn't executed. That would have been too easy. That would have made him a martyr. Instead, Skanderbeg turned his traitorous nephew into a living exhibit of Ottoman failure. He paraded Hamza in front of the surviving Albanian forces, a broken, defeated man stripped of his silk robes and his Ottoman titles. Then, Skanderbeg did something completely unexpected. He sold him. He ransomed Hamza back to the Ottomans. Why? Because Skanderbeg knew exactly what Sultan Mehmet did to generals who failed him, especially generals who promised the world and delivered a massacre. Hamza wasn't welcomed back to Istanbul as a prince. He was exiled, spending the rest of his miserable life begging on the streets, entirely forgotten by the empire he sold his soul to join. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a chilling message to anyone else in Skanderbeg's inner circle who might be tempted by Ottoman gold. But while Skanderbeg was cleaning out the traitors in his camp, a new, much more insidious threat was creeping into his ranks. And this time, it wasn't coming from the east. It was coming from his allies. You see, success breeds jealousy, and in 15th century Europe, jealousy was a lethal weapon. In the immediate aftermath of Albulena, Skanderbeg was the absolute toast of Europe. Pope Calixtus III named him Athleta Christi, the champion of Christ. Venice sent him gold. The King of Naples sent him weapons. He was the undisputed savior of Christendom. But behind the lavish titles and the diplomatic praise, the rulers of Europe were playing a very dark game. They loved that Skanderbeg was bleeding the Ottomans dry, but they were absolutely terrified of what he might do if he ever actually won. Think about it. The Republic of Venice was a maritime superpower. They controlled the trade routes in the Adriatic. The last thing they wanted was a massive, unified, heavily armed Albanian kingdom right in their backyard, led by a military genius who had just vaporized 80,000 Turks. So, the Venetians began a quiet campaign of sabotage. They smiled in Skanderbeg's face, called him a hero, and then secretly cut off his supply lines. They refused to let his ships dock in certain ports. They even started bribing local Albanian lords to challenge Skanderbeg's authority. The logic was brutally cynical. Keep the dragon strong enough to fight the Ottomans, but weak enough that he can never threaten Venice. Skanderbeg realized he was caught in a lethal trap. He wasn't just fighting a war of survival against the greatest empire on earth. He was fighting a shadow war against the very people he was bleeding to protect. And Mehmet the Conqueror knew it. The Sultan had spies embedded deep within the Venetian Senate. When he heard that Skanderbeg's allies were stabbing him in the back, Mehmet didn't send another army right away. He just smiled. He let the poison work. He gave Skanderbeg 3 years to exhaust his treasury, alienate his nobles, and realize that the West was never going to send a real army to help him. The West was perfectly happy to fight the Ottoman Empire down to the very last Albanian. By 1460, the euphoria of Albulena had faded into a grinding, miserable reality. The gold ran out, the harvests failed, and the Ottoman raiding parties returned, not with 80,000 men, but with small, lightning-fast cavalry units designed to burn a village and disappear before Skanderbeg could even saddle his horse. It was a war of 1,000 cuts. Mehmet had finally cracked the code. He realized that you don't hunt a dragon with an army. You starve it in its cave. Skanderbeg was forced into the one position he hated most: defense. He had to spread his forces thin, trying to protect every mountain pass, every coastal road, every farming valley. He was playing a massive, bloody game of whack-a-mole with the greatest logistical machine of the age. The psychological toll was unimaginable. He hadn't slept a full night in a decade. He was aging rapidly, his body battered by 20 years of constant frontline combat. But Mehmet underestimated one crucial detail. When you push a genius into a corner, he doesn't surrender. He rewrites the rules entirely. If Venice wouldn't give him an army, and the Pope could only give him prayers, Skanderbeg decided he would do something so audacious, so completely unhinged, that it would force the entire continent to march to his drumbeat. He wasn't going to sit in his mountains and wait to be starved out. He was going to invade Italy. Yes, you heard that right. The man who had just saved the Italian peninsula from an Ottoman apocalypse was about to cross the Adriatic and tear it apart himself. Why? Because the King of Naples, Ferdinand I, one of Skanderbeg's few genuine allies, and the man who supplied his troops with critical grain, was facing a massive rebellion. The French House of Anjou, backed by disgruntled Italian barons, was moving to overthrow Ferdinand. If Naples fell, Skanderbeg's only reliable supply line would be severed. Albania would be totally, permanently isolated. Skanderbeg didn't wait for permission. In the winter of 1461, he packed his battle-hardened veterans onto a small fleet of rickety ships, crossed the treacherous Adriatic Sea, and landed right in the middle of a foreign civil war. The Italian mercenaries thought it was a joke. Here was a ragged band of mountain men, outnumbered, fighting on foreign soil, inserting themselves into a conflict between the wealthiest royal houses in Europe. The French commanders openly mocked him from their heavily fortified positions. But they forgot one thing. These weren't regular soldiers. These were the ghosts of Albulena. These were men who had stared down 80,000 elite janissaries and walked away laughing. And in the next 30 days, Skanderbeg was about to show the powdered, wealthy lords of Western Europe what real, unadulterated terror looked like. August 1461, the sun-baked plains of Apulia, southern Italy. Jean d'Anjou, the French commander backed by a coalition of rebel Italian barons, is sitting in his command tent. He is winning. He has King Ferdinand of Naples boxed in, starved out, and on the verge of total surrender. The French have the numbers, the gold, and the most heavily armored knights in the world. Then a scout bursts into the tent, breathless. He reports that a fleet of ragged ships has just landed on the coast. An army of men in wolfskins and chainmail has disembarked. The Albanians are here. Jean d'Anjou laughs. To the powdered nobility of Western Europe, this was a comedy. Italian warfare in the 15th century was a gentleman's game. It was played like chess. Mercenary armies, the condottieri, fought in heavily armored, slow-moving squares. They didn't fight to kill. They fought to capture, because captured nobles meant massive ransoms. War was a business transaction. Battles were scheduled. Bloodshed was kept to a polite minimum. What Jean d'Anjou didn't realize was that he was about to play chess against a man who was bringing a flamethrower to the board. Skanderbeg hadn't brought a massive army. He only brought 2,500 of his most hardened cavalry veterans. These were men who had spent the last 2 decades fighting a daily war of extermination against the Ottoman Empire. They didn't know how to fight for ransom. They only knew how to fight for survival. The French decided to swat this nuisance away. They sent their elite heavy cavalry to crush the lightly armored Albanians. It was supposed to be a slaughter, and it was, just not the one the French expected. When the French knights charged, forming a massive, glittering wall of steel, Skanderbeg's cavalry didn't brace for impact. They didn't lock shields. They simply scattered. They melted into the Italian countryside like smoke. The French knights laughed, assuming the mountain peasants had routed at the mere sight of real European armor. But when the sun went down, the laughter stopped. The Albanians hadn't fled. They were waiting for the heavy armor to become a liability. In the dead of night, Skanderbeg's men crept into the French camps. They didn't announce their presence with trumpets. They didn't demand a surrender. They simply started slitting throats, burning supply wagons, and hamstringing the expensive French war horses. By the time the French knights could strap on their 50 pounds of plate armor, the Albanians were already gone, vanishing back into the dark. Jean d'Anjou panicked. He realized he wasn't fighting a mercenary. He was fighting a phantom. But Skanderbeg knew hit and run tactics wouldn't win the war. He had to break the French army in a pitched battle to save Naples. And he had a massive problem. His light cavalry swords couldn't pierce French plate armor in broad daylight. If they fought head-on, his men would be crushed under the hooves of the armored war horses. He needed the French out of their armor. Or better yet, he needed them to cook inside it. Skanderbeg launched a brutal, scorched earth campaign across the Apulian countryside. He burned the fields. He poisoned the wells. He choked off the supply lines. By August, the Italian heat was sweltering. The French army, locked inside their tin cans, was baking alive. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and furious. Skanderbeg had them exactly where he wanted them. He positioned his forces near the town of Orsara. He sent a small, lightly armed vanguard to directly mock the French lines. It was a deliberate insult. The prideful French knights took the bait. They lowered their lances and charged. Once again, the Albanians broke and ran. The French pursued, desperate to finally catch the ghosts that had been tormenting them. They chased the Albanians up a long, dusty ridge. The heavy war horses foamed at the mouth. The knights were suffocating in their helmets. When they reached the crest of the hill, expecting to run down fleeing cowards, their blood ran cold. Skanderbeg wasn't retreating. He was waiting. His veterans were lined up, holding maces, war hammers, and heavy axes. They didn't aim for the armored men. They aimed for the exhausted horses. In a matter of minutes, the pride of the French army was in the dirt. A knight in 50 pounds of armor, thrown from a dead horse in the middle of a 90-degree summer day, isn't a soldier anymore. He is a turtle on its back. The Albanians fell upon them with blunt force weapons, cracking plate armor like crab shells. The massacre was absolute. In less than a month, Skanderbeg completely vaporized the French rebellion. He shattered an entire European coalition with 2,500 men. King Ferdinand of Naples was so overwhelmed with gratitude that he offered Skanderbeg massive estates, castles, and enough gold to live out the rest of his days as the wealthiest duke in Italy. Ferdinand begged him, "Stay. The West loves you. You never have to sleep in a cold mountain camp again." It was the ultimate temptation. The dragon had earned his rest. But Skanderbeg looked across the Adriatic Sea. He knew that while he was busy saving the West, a storm of biblical proportions was brewing in the East. He turned down the gold. He turned down the castles. He packed his men onto their ships and sailed back to the nightmare. Because Sultan Mehmet II was done playing games. It is now 1466. A decade has passed since the miracle at Albulena. Sultan Mehmet has spent those 10 years conquering the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, securing the Balkans, and building an industrial war machine that defied human comprehension. He realized that his generals could not defeat the dragon. The psychological block was too deep. So, Mehmet decided to do it himself. He didn't send an army. He brought the apocalypse. Historical records state Mehmet marched on Albania with a force of 150,000 men. Let that sink in. He brought more soldiers to a tiny mountainous strip of land than there were people living in the entire city of London. And he wasn't there to fight a field battle. He was there to rip the beating heart out of the Albanian resistance. He was marching on Skanderbeg's capital, the impregnable fortress of Kruja. To guarantee success, Mehmet brought a weapon of mass destruction. He brought bronze founders to cast massive siege cannons right on the battlefield, cannons so large they fired stone balls weighing over 600 pounds. He intended to grind the walls of Kruja into white powder. As the 150,000-man army flooded the valley below the fortress, the sky turned black with the smoke of 1,000 campfires. Mehmet ordered his heralds to approach the walls and demand immediate, unconditional surrender. He expected Skanderbeg to look down from the battlements, see the absolute hopelessness of the situation, and finally, break. But when Mehmet looked up at the walls, he realized something that made his stomach drop. Skanderbeg wasn't in the castle. The Sultan had brought the largest army in the world to trap the dragon in a cage, only to realize the dragon was already standing right behind him. Skanderbeg had left a skeleton crew of 4,000 men inside Kruja to hold the walls. Meanwhile, he had taken his elite mobile strike force and hidden them in the jagged peaks of Mount Tumanishta, the exact same mountains he used at Albulena. Mehmet had 150,000 men. But an army of that size has a fatal flaw. It has to eat. To feed 150,000 soldiers, the Ottomans relied on massive supply caravans stretching all the way back to Macedonia. Skanderbeg didn't attack the Ottoman camp. He attacked the food. Every single day, Ottoman supply trains were ambushed, slaughtered, and burned to ash. The mountain passes became a graveyard of Ottoman logistics. Within weeks, the largest, most terrifying army on the planet began to starve. Disease ripped through the crowded, filthy camps. Mehmet was trapped in a paradox. He couldn't storm the walls of Kruja because they were too steep. He couldn't starve the castle out because Skanderbeg was starving him out. And he couldn't send his army into the mountains to hunt Skanderbeg because the terrain funneled his massive numbers into fatal choke points where the Albanians slaughtered them like livestock. The besiegers had become the besieged. The psychological terror of fighting an invisible enemy began to break the Ottoman morale. Sentries were found with their throats cut, just yards from the Sultan's royal pavilion. Entire cavalry units sent out to forage for food simply never returned. The Sultan's elite janissaries, men who feared nothing, began to whisper that George Castrioti wasn't a man at all. They called him a demon forged in the rocks of the Dinaric Alps. By late autumn, Mehmet the Conqueror, the man who had shattered Constantinople and styled himself the Caesar of Rome, was forced to do the unthinkable. He ordered a retreat. He marched his starving, broken army out of Albania, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead. It was the most humiliating defeat of his life, but Mehmet was a fanatic. He couldn't completely abandon the siege without shattering his prestige. So, as he retreated, he left behind a massive blockade force of 80,000 men to keep Kruja surrounded through the winter. He needed a commander who wouldn't be intimidated by the dragon's psychological warfare. He needed someone who knew how Albanians thought. So, he left the army in the hands of Balaban Badera. Balaban wasn't a Turk. He was an Albanian. Decades earlier, he had been taken as a child through the Devshirme system, the Ottoman blood tax. He had been brainwashed, trained, and hardened into one of the Sultan's most ruthless generals. Balaban didn't fear Skanderbeg. He hated him. And Balaban had a plan. He knew he couldn't outmaneuver Skanderbeg in the mountains. So, he decided to break Skanderbeg's mind. In the spring of 1467, Balaban managed to set an ambush of his own. In a fierce skirmish near the river Shkumbin, Ottoman forces successfully captured 8 of Skanderbeg's top commanders. These weren't just officers. These were Skanderbeg's closest friends, men who had bled with him for 20 years. Balaban sent a message to the mountain camps. He wanted Skanderbeg to know he had them. He expected the dragon to finally negotiate, to surrender a fortress, or at least beg for terms to save the lives of his brothers in arms. Skanderbeg refused to negotiate with a traitor. What Balaban did next sent a shockwave of absolute horror through Europe. He didn't just execute the commanders, he sent them to Istanbul. Sultan Mehmet, eager for revenge after his humiliation at Kruja, ordered a public spectacle. In the center of the Ottoman capital, Skanderbeg's closest friends were subjected to 15 days of unspeakable torture. They were slowly flayed alive, their skin peeled from their bodies while they were kept conscious. Then, their bodies were thrown to the street dogs. When the news reached the Albanian camps, silence fell over the mountains. Balaban Badera smiled. He thought he had finally done it. He thought he had broken the spirit of the Albanian resistance. He had shown them that the dragon could not protect them. He expected the Albanian army to crumble, to desert, to weep. But Balaban had made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't break Skanderbeg's spirit. He completely removed Skanderbeg's mercy. The man who came down from the mountains a week later wasn't a tactician playing a game of numbers. He was an avatar of pure, unadulterated vengeance. Skanderbeg didn't issue orders for a strategic delay. He ordered a total, apocalyptic assault on Balaban's blockade force. He divided his men, gathered every peasant with a pitchfork, and unleashed a wave of violence so extreme that the Ottoman lines simply disintegrated. The Ottoman blockade around Kruja didn't just break, it evaporated. Skanderbeg wasn't fighting to win a battle anymore. He was fighting to eradicate. He struck the Ottoman camps at midnight. There were no horns this time, no grand theatrical illusions, just cold mechanical slaughter. He ordered his cavalry to bypass the regular infantry and target the command tents directly. He was severing the Ottoman nervous system in the dark. Within minutes, the camp was a headless, panicked mob. But Balaban Badera, the architect of this nightmare, wasn't going to die in a tent. He mounted his warhorse, frantically rallying his personal elite guard for a desperate breakout. He knew the terrain. If he could just punch through the Albanian perimeter and reach the eastern tree line, he could escape back to Istanbul. He almost made it. But as Balaban's guard smashed through the outer defenses, a single musket shot rang out from the darkness. It didn't hit a shield. It didn't hit a horse. It caught Balaban directly in the throat. The traitor who had flayed Skanderbeg's best friends choked on his own blood, falling face first into the Albanian mud. With their commander dead, the remaining Ottoman blockade force surrendered. They threw down their weapons and begged for the one thing they had denied Skanderbeg's friends: mercy. But Skanderbeg wasn't taking prisoners that day. Every Ottoman soldier caught in the valley was put to the sword. It was a dark, terrifying shift in the dragon's legacy. He had proven to the Sultan and to the world that attempting to use psychological terror against him would only buy you a one-way ticket to hell. The siege was broken. Kruja was safe. The Ottoman war machine had been humiliated yet again. But as Skanderbeg stood in the blood-soaked mud of his homeland, the victory felt agonizingly hollow. He looked at his exhausted, battered army. He knew the absolute truth that no one in the royal courts of Europe wanted to admit. Sultan Mehmet II wasn't going to stop. He had infinite men. He had infinite gold. And his ego had been bruised so badly that it could only be healed by Skanderbeg's head on a spike. The dragon had won the battle. But the clock was rapidly ticking on his own mortality. By the winter of 1467, Skanderbeg was a man running on fumes. He was in his early 60s. He had spent a quarter of a century sleeping in freezing caves, fighting in the mud, and carrying the entire weight of Western civilization on his back. His body was finally failing. Malaria, the silent killer of the Mediterranean, had caught the man no Ottoman blade could touch. He called an emergency council in the coastal city of Lazia. He needed to unify the squabbling Albanian princes one last time. He needed to ensure that when he was gone, the titanium shield he had built over Europe wouldn't shatter. As he stood before his lords, a violent fever racked his body. His hands shook. He couldn't even lift his legendary sword. The room fell into a terrified, suffocating silence. The invincible king was dying. And right at that exact moment, a scout burst through the doors. An Ottoman strike force of 15,000 cavalry had just crossed the border. Sultan Mehmet's spies had delivered the news. The dragon is bedridden. The shield is cracked. Strike now. This wasn't a standard army. It was a lightning-fast death squad, sent to burn the capital to the ground before Skanderbeg could even draw his dying breath. His generals panicked. Without Skanderbeg on the battlefield, Albanian morale was virtually non-existent. They urged him to stay in bed. They begged him to board a ship and flee to Venice, while they tried to buy him time. Instead, Skanderbeg called for his armor. He couldn't stand. He couldn't sit on his horse without passing out. So, he gave his generals the most terrifying, audacious order of his entire career. "Take my standard," he whispered. "Ride out to meet them, and when you hit their lines, tell them I am watching." The Albanian cavalry rode out to the border. They were vastly outnumbered, exhausted, and leaderless. When the Ottoman commanders saw the small defensive force, they laughed. They ordered a full frontal charge, fully expecting the Albanian lines to instantly shatter. Then, the Albanian vanguard raised the black double-headed eagle banner. A rumor swept through the Ottoman ranks faster than a plague. Skanderbeg is here. He wasn't. He was miles away, sweating through his bedsheets. But the psychological trauma of the last 25 years was so deeply embedded in the Ottoman DNA that the mere sight of his flag triggered mass hysteria. The ghost of Albulena had returned. The massive Ottoman vanguard suddenly halted in its tracks. The cavalry broke formation. The commanders screamed for order, but the terror was absolute. Before the Albanians even swung a single sword, the Turkish force turned and fled in a blind panic. They trampled their own men trying to get back across the border. Skanderbeg had literally defeated an army of 15,000 men without getting out of bed. His reputation alone had become a weapon of mass destruction. When the generals returned to Lasia with the news of the miraculous victory, they found Skanderbeg smiling. He closed his eyes, and the dragon of Albania exhaled his final breath. It was January 17th, 1468. The shield of Europe had finally fallen. When the news reached Istanbul, Sultan Mehmet II reportedly threw his hands to the heavens in sheer euphoria. Historical chronicles say he shouted to his court, "A great beast has fallen. Never again will the earth bear such a monster." Mehmet thought the nightmare was over. He thought that without Skanderbeg, Albania would surrender by dawn. The path to Rome was finally open. He was dead wrong. Skanderbeg didn't just train an army. He forged a nation of iron. For the next 10 years, even without their king, the Albanians held the line. They fought with a suicidal, fanatic ferocity that completely baffled the Sultan. Kruja, the fortress that Mehmet swore to level to the ground, held out against the full might of the Ottoman Empire until 1478, a full decade after Skanderbeg's death. But that decade bought Europe everything. Remember the fragile Italian Renaissance? 10 years was a lifetime. By the time the Ottomans finally pushed past the Albanian mountains and reached the Adriatic coast, the world had changed. Venice had heavily fortified its fleet. The Pope had organized a massive coastal defense. A young Leonardo da Vinci was now a grown man, drafting advanced weapons of war for Italian dukes. The window of opportunity for an easy Ottoman conquest of Rome had violently slammed shut. And it was bolted shut by the ghost of George Castrioti. History is almost always written by empires. It is dictated by the massive, unstoppable forces of geography, wealth, and numbers. But sometimes, history is derailed by a single man. Skanderbeg shouldn't have won at Albulena. He shouldn't have survived the siege of Kruja. He shouldn't have been able to trick an empire of 80,000 men with a beggar's cloak and a few mountain horns. But he understood something that Sultan Mehmet never could. A man fighting for conquest will run when the odds turn against him. But a man fighting for his home will burn the world down before he lets you take it. The Ottomans eventually took the land, but they never conquered the legend. When Turkish troops finally breached Skanderbeg's tomb in the city of Lesia over a decade later, they didn't burn his body. They didn't desecrate his grave in revenge. They did something far stranger. They dug up his bones, broke them into fragments, encased them in silver and gold, and wore them as amulets around their necks. Even in death, the most feared, fanatic warriors on the planet believed that just holding a tiny piece of the dragon of Albania would make them invincible in battle. And looking at what he achieved on that dusty afternoon in the valley of Albulena, they might have been right. The Battle of Albulena was not just a military victory. It was a resounding answer to the question that has haunted history for centuries. How can a solitary soul break the shackles of a cruel destiny? We began this story with the image of a ragged army of 8,000 men standing before the abyss of annihilation, facing 80,000 cold, sharp swords of the most powerful empire in the world. We asked ourselves how a man, betrayed by his own blood, forgotten by the world, and despised by his enemies, could turn the tables on a bright, sunny afternoon. The answer does not lie in steel, nor in sturdy city walls. The answer lies in the silence of a 90-day disappearance, a silence not of fear, but the silence of a storm gathering its final energy before tearing the sky apart. Skanderbeg did not run away. He embarked on a journey deep into the mind of the enemy. By accepting the trampling of his honor, letting his people suffer, and becoming a ghost himself, he gifted the Ottomans their most dangerous weapon: arrogance. He understood that an army of 80,000 could be defeated if they believed they had already won. He turned the pain of Hamza Castrioti's betrayal into a mirror reflecting the enemy's complacency. When Skanderbeg stood in the enemy camp disguised as a beggar, he was not merely observing burial pits or barricades. He was seeing through the hollowness in the souls of those who believed numbers could substitute for spirit. The trumpet call at Albulena on September 2nd, 1457, was not just the order to attack. It was the sound of a bitter awakening for an empire sleeping on the illusion of victory. 90 days of humiliation, 90 days of eating leaves and sleeping in caves by the 8,000 Albanian warriors were condensed into a crushing blow, striking straight at the vital point of the giant monster. In that moment, the laws of mathematics were broken. A 10-to-1 ratio becomes meaningless when one side fights to conquer, while the other fights to survive. Look back at what was salvaged from the ashes of that battle. If Albulena had been a defeat, the geniuses of the Renaissance, the Leonardo da Vinci's, the Michelangelos, the Raphaels, might have been nothing more than nameless figures buried under the hooves of the Janissary forces. The light of Western intellect, art, and humanism was protected by the men standing in the cold winds of the Dinaric Alps. Skanderbeg did not just defend the borders of Albania, he bought time for an entire civilization. He placed a bronze shield protecting Rome, Florence, and Venice, so that the seedlings of a new era could blossom without being incinerated by the fires of war. The greatest salvation Skanderbeg left behind is not liberated lands, but an immortal testament to the power of the human will. He proved that when a nation refuses to kneel, even the greatest empires must tremble. When he passed away, he did not leave behind a wealthy dynasty or massive architectural structures. He left a legend so powerful that his enemies had to dig up his grave to use his bones as talismans. That is the ultimate acknowledgement a warrior can receive. Even when turned to dust, the soul of the dragon of Albania remains a terror and a hope. Today, when we face seemingly insurmountable challenges, the story of Albulena reminds us: darkness may envelop, enemies may be numerous, and betrayal may cut deep into the flesh. But if we know how to be patient in silence, how to turn pain into strength, and how to maintain faith in our righteous cause, we can create miracles. The victory at Albulena was not a historical stroke of luck. It was a symphony of unparalleled sacrifice, intellect, and courage. It serves as a reminder that a person with a great purpose can alter the flow of time. George Castrioti is gone, but his trumpet call still echoes through the canyons of Albania, through the corridors of history, reminding each of us that the dragon never truly disappears. It merely waits for the moment to rise again, when the world needs a hero who dares to believe in the impossible. History carved his name with blood and fire, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of eternal freedom. And in the splendor of the Albulena victory, we find the most core answer. There is no fortress more solid than patriotism, and no army more powerful than a nation determined never to be enslaved. The light from Albulena remains, shining through the darkness of the ages, affirming an immutable truth. One man, one sword, and an unyielding spirit are enough to stop an entire empire. The Battle of Albulena was not just a military victory. It was a resounding answer to the question that has haunted history for centuries. How can a solitary soul break the shackles of a cruel destiny? We began this story with the image of a ragged army of 8,000 men standing before the abyss of annihilation, facing 80,000 cold, sharp swords of the most powerful empire in the world. We asked ourselves how a man, betrayed by his own blood, forgotten by the world, and despised by his enemies, could turn the tables on a bright, sunny afternoon. The answer does not lie in steel, nor in sturdy city walls. The answer lies in the silence of a 90-day disappearance, a silence not of fear, but the silence of a storm gathering its final energy before tearing the sky apart. Skanderbeg did not run away. He embarked on a journey deep into the mind of the enemy. By accepting the trampling of his honor, letting his people suffer, and becoming a ghost himself, he gifted the Ottomans their most dangerous weapon: arrogance. He understood that an army of 80,000 could be defeated if they believed they had already won. He turned the pain of Hamza Castrioti's betrayal into a mirror reflecting the enemy's complacency. When Skanderbeg stood in the enemy camp disguised as a beggar, he was not merely observing burial pits or barricades. He was seeing through the hollowness in the souls of those who believed numbers could substitute for spirit. The trumpet call at Albulena on September 2nd, 1457, was not just the order to attack. It was the sound of a bitter awakening for an empire sleeping on the illusion of victory. 90 days of humiliation, 90 days of eating leaves and sleeping in caves by the 8,000 Albanian warriors were condensed into a crushing blow, striking straight at the vital point of the giant monster. In that moment, the laws of mathematics were broken. A 10-to-1 ratio becomes meaningless when one side fights to conquer while the other fights to survive. Look back at what was salvaged from the ashes of that battle. If Albulena had been a defeat, the geniuses of the Renaissance, the Leonardo da Vinci's, the Michelangelos, the Raphaels, might have been nothing more than nameless figures buried under the hooves of the Janissary forces. The light of Western intellect, art, and humanism was protected by the men standing in the cold winds of the Dinaric Alps. Skanderbeg did not just defend the borders of Albania. He bought time for an entire civilization. He placed a bronze shield protecting Rome, Florence, and Venice, so that the seedlings of a new era could blossom without being incinerated by the fires of war. The greatest salvation Skanderbeg left behind is not liberated lands, but an immortal testament to the power of the human will. He proved that when a nation refuses to kneel, even the greatest empires must tremble. When he passed away, he did not leave behind a wealthy dynasty or massive architectural structures. He left a legend so powerful that his enemies had to dig up his grave to use his bones as talismans. That is the ultimate acknowledgement a warrior can receive. Even when turned to dust, the soul of the dragon of Albania remains a terror and a hope. Today, when we face seemingly insurmountable challenges, the story of Albulena reminds us: darkness may envelop, enemies may be numerous, and betrayal may cut deep into the flesh. But if we know how to be patient in silence, how to turn pain into strength, and how to maintain faith in our righteous cause, we can create miracles. The victory at Albulena was not a historical stroke of luck. It was a symphony of unparalleled sacrifice, intellect, and courage. It serves as a reminder that a person with a great purpose can alter the flow of time. George Castrioti is gone, but his trumpet call still echoes through the canyons of Albania, through the corridors of history, reminding each of us that the dragon never truly disappears. It merely waits for the moment to rise again, when the world needs a hero who dares to believe in the impossible. History carved his name with blood and fire, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of eternal freedom. And in the splendor of the Albulena victory, we find the most core answer. There is no fortress more solid than patriotism, and no army more powerful than a nation determined never to be enslaved. The light from Albulena remains, shining through the darkness of the ages, affirming an immutable truth. One man, one sword, and an unyielding spirit are enough to stop an entire empire. The Battle of Albulena was not just a shining chapter in military chronicles. It is an endless hymn to the power of the human will in the face of the harshest destinies. We started with the image of a ragged army of 8,000 standing on the brink of destruction, facing 80,000 sharp swords of an empire at the peak of its power. But through Skanderbeg, we realize an eternal truth. In the game of masters, numbers are just an illusion, and fear is the only shackle we place on ourselves. The 90-day silence of the Dragon of Albania was not a manifestation of escape or cowardice, but a divine patience. He accepted the trampling of his honor, allowed his people to suffer, and became a ghost himself, solely to gift the enemy their most dangerous weapon, arrogance. Skanderbeg proved that the most terrifying enemy is not the one with the most troops, but the one who can stand in the shadows, see through the hollowness in the opponent's soul, and wait for the moment they fall asleep on the illusion of victory. Look at what was saved from the ashes of that battle. If Albulena had fallen, the light of the Renaissance might have been extinguished by the hooves of the Janissaries, right from when it was a fragile seedling. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, or Raphael might have just been nameless figures buried under the dust of history. With a trumpet call that tore the sky apart and a tactic far beyond all mathematical logic, Skanderbeg erected a fortress wall made of iron spirit, defending not only national borders, but an entire Western civilization. The overarching lesson of Albulena goes beyond the boundaries of a battle. It is proof that when an individual carries an unshakable faith and a burning love for their homeland, they can break all the shackles of fate. Skanderbeg taught us that the strongest fortress is not on a mountaintop or made of bricks and stones, but lies in the chests of those who never know how to kneel. He turned the pain of betrayal into strength, turned a deficit into elite prowess, and turned death into immortality. Even though his bones were later dug up by enemies to be used as talismans, his spirit was never subdued. Albulena is a stern reminder for all future generations. When you are backed into a corner, when the whole world writes your obituary, that is also when you are the strongest. Remember the trumpet call on the Tumanishta Mountains whenever you face adversity. Remember that even when confronting 80,000 difficulties, with just a burning heart and a sharp mind, you hold the key to changing the entire flow of time. History does not belong to those with the most troops. History belongs to those who dare to believe in the impossible and fight until their last breath to make it a reality. The Battle of Albulena did not just end in blood and road dust. It opened a new chapter in how we perceive true human power. Skanderbeg proved a truth that all leaders and strategists today must still bow their heads and learn. When all material resources are exhausted, intellect and an understanding of the opponent's psychology are the only infinite resources to turn the tide. But history has more than one Skanderbeg, and Albulena is not the only time a ghost stood up to snatch victory from the hands of the arrogant. Stories of individuals taking on many, those who dare to stand alone against the current of the era with silence and strategy, are the mirrors that help us clearly see our own mettle in a modern world full of similar pressures. On this channel, we do not simply recount what happened in the past in a dry manner. We peel back every layer of fateful decisions, analyze the deadly mistakes of giant empires, and honor the minds brave enough to change the trajectory of humanity. For you to stay until this very moment proves you are not an ordinary viewer. You are someone hungry for truth, depth, and practical lessons on strategic thinking, not superficial entertainment that passes after a few seconds. That is why your companionship in this community is incredibly important. By hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications, you are not just offering moral support to the production team. You are making a commitment to continue the journey of excavating the fascinating hidden corners of military history together. We need people like you to ensure that these stories of resilience are never forgotten. And if Skanderbeg's genius at Albulena astonished you, there is another story, another tactic equally insane and illustrious that once occurred. It is the story of how another general turned the enemy's despair and trap into the most devastating thrust in history, a testament to how to win a war before it actually begins. Do not look away from the screen. The next video we have prepared for you right below will take you even deeper into the world of the greatest conspiracies and deceptions of all time. Click on it right now to continue this flow of thought and discover what happens when a cornered man decides to flip the entire chessboard. We will see you there to decode the greatest mysteries history ever tried to hide.